In 1959, a group of skiers prepare for an expedition across the northern Urals in Sverdlovsk Oblast, Soviet Union in the winter months. Igor Dyatlov, a 23-year-old radio engineering student at the Ural Polytechnical Institute, assembled a group of 9 people for this trip, most of whom were fellow students and peers at the university. The initial group consisted of 8 men and 2 women, but one member later returned due to health issues. Each member of the group was an experienced skier. The members of group are Igor Dyatlov, 23, Yuri Doroshenko, 21, Ludmila Dubinina, 20, Georgy Krivonyshenko, 23, Alexander Kolevatov, 24, Zinaida Kalmogorova, 22, Rustam Slobodin, 23, Nikolai Brignuls, 23, Semyon Zolotaryov, 38 and Yuri Yudin, 21. The plan was to reach the far northern regions of the Sverdlovsk Oblast and the upper streams of the Lozva River. The Sverdlovsk city approves the permit for the group of 10 people on January 8, 1959. The first part of expedition was to reach Otorten mountain. This expedition was undertaken in the winter months of February, the most difficult time to traverse. Little did they know that only one of them would survive this expedition. This is the story of Dyatlov Pass incident. In the early morning hours of January 25, 1959, the group arrived by train at Ivdel, a town at the center of the northern province of Sverdlovsk Oblast. They then took a truck to Vizhai, a lorry village that is the last inhabited settlement to the north. On January 27, they began their trek toward Otorten mountain. On January 28, one member, Yuri Yudin, turned back due to knee and joint pain that made him unable to continue the hike. The remaining 9 hikers continued the trek. On January 31st, the group arrived at the edge of a highland area and began to prepare for climbing. In a wooded valley, they cached surplus food and equipment that would be used for the trip back. The next day, the hikers started to move through the pass. It seems they planned to get over the pass and make camp for the next night on the opposite side, but because of worsening weather conditions, snowstorms and decreasing visibility, they lost their direction and deviated west, toward the top of Kholat Syakhl, which was called Dead Mountain or Silent Peak by native Mansi people. When they realized their mistake, the group decided to set up camp there on the slope of the mountain, rather than moving 1.5 kilometers, 1 mile, downhill to a forested area that would have offered some shelter from the weather. Before leaving on this expedition, Igor Dyatlov had agreed he would send a telegram to their sports club as soon as the group returned to Vizhai. It was expected that this would happen no later than February 12, but Igor had told Yuri Yudin, before he departed from the group, that he expected it to be longer. When the 12th passed and no messages had been received, there was no immediate reaction, as delays of a few days were common with such expeditions. On February 20th, their families began to worry and demanded a rescue operation, and the head of the institute sent the first rescue groups, consisting of volunteer students and teachers. Later, the army and police forces became involved, with planes and helicopters ordered to join the operation. On February 26, the searchers found the group's abandoned and badly damaged tent on Kholat Syakhl. The campsite baffled the search party. The tent was half torn down and covered with snow. It was empty, and all the group's belongings and shoes had been left behind. Investigators said the tent had been cut open from inside. 9 sets of footprints, left by people wearing only socks or a single shoe or even barefoot, could be followed, leading down to the edge of a nearby wood, on the opposite side of the pass, 1.5 kilometers or 1 mile to the northeast. After 500 meters or 1,600 feet, these tracks were covered with snow. At the forest's edge, under a large Siberian pine tree, the rescue team found the visible remains of a small fire. There were the first 2 bodies, those of Georgy Krivonyshenko and Yuri Doroshenko, shoeless and dressed only in underwear. The branches on the tree were broken up to 5 meters high, suggesting that one of the skiers had climbed up to look for something, perhaps the camp or tried to escape from something. Between the pine tree and the camp, the searchers found 3 more corpses, Igor Dyatlov, Zinaida Kalmogorova, and Rustam Slobodin, who died in poses suggesting that they were attempting to return to the tent. They were found at distances of 300, 480, and 630 meters or 980, 1570, and 2070 feet from the tree. But finding the remaining 4 travelers took more than 2 months. They were finally found on May 4 under 4 meters or 13 feet of snow in a ravine 75 meters or 246 feet further into the woods from the pine tree. 3 of the 4 were better dressed than the others, and there were signs that some clothing of those who had died first had been removed for use by the others. Lyudmila Dubinina was wearing Georgy Krivonashenko's burned, torn trousers, and her left foot and shin were wrapped in a torn jacket. Authorities started an investigation immediately after the first 5 bodies were found. A medical examination found no injuries that might have led to their deaths, and it was concluded that they had all died of hypothermia. Rustam Slobodin had a small crack in his skull, but it was not thought to be a fatal wound. An examination of the 4 bodies found in May shifted the narrative of the incident. 3 of the hikers had fatal injuries. Nikolai Brignuls had major skull damage, and Lyudmila Dubinina and Semyon Zolotaryov had major chest fractures. According to medical examiner, the force required to cause such damage would have been extremely high, comparable to that of a car crash. Notably, the bodies had no external wounds associated with the bone fractures, as if they had been subjected to a high level of pressure. All 4 bodies found at the bottom of the creek in a running stream of water had soft tissue damage to their head and face. For example, Dubinina was missing her tongue, eyes, part of the lips, as well as facial tissue and a fragment of skull bone, while Zolotaryov had his eyeballs missing, and Alexander Kolevatov his eyebrows. The forensic expert performing the post-mortem examination judged that these injuries happened post-mortem due to the location of the bodies in a stream. There was initial speculation that the indigenous Mansi people, reindeer herders local to the area, had attacked and murdered the group for encroaching upon their lands. Several Mansi were interrogated, but the investigation indicated that the nature of the deaths did not support this hypothesis. Only the hikers' footprints were visible, and they showed no sign of hand-to-hand struggle. Although the temperature was very low, around -25 to -30 degrees Celsius, -13 to -22 degrees Fahrenheit, with a storm blowing, the dead were only partially dressed. Some had only one shoe, while others wore only socks. Some were found wrapped in snips of ripped clothes that seemed to have been cut from those who were already dead. In conclusion, 6 of the group members died of hypothermia and 3 of fatal injuries, and there were no indications of other people nearby on Kholat Syakhl apart from the 9 travelers. The tent had been ripped open from within, and the victims had died 6 to 8 hours after their last meal. Traces from the camp showed that all group members left the campsite of their own accord, on foot. And some levels of radiation were found on one victim's clothing. Theory of an attack by the indigenous Mansi people was unlikely because that the fatal injuries of the 3 bodies could not have been caused by human beings. The force of the blows had been too strong and no soft tissue had been damaged. At the time, the official conclusion was that the group members had died because of a compelling natural force. The inquest officially ceased in May 1959. Another group of hikers reported that they saw strange orange spheres in the sky to the north on the night of the incident. Similar spheres were observed in Ivdel and adjacent areas continually during the period from February to March 1959, by various independent witnesses. One of the police officers, who led the investigation in 1959, published an article stating that the investigation team had no rational explanation for the incident. He also stated that, after his team reported that they had seen flying spheres, he then received direct orders from high-ranking regional officials to dismiss this claim. One theory suggested that avalanche is more plausible cause, and the group woke up in a panic and cut their way out the tent either because an avalanche had covered the entrance to their tent or because they were scared that an avalanche was imminent. They were poorly clothed because they had been sleeping, and ran to the safety of the nearby woods, where trees would help slow oncoming snow. In the darkness of night, they got separated into 2 or 3 groups. One group made a fire while the others tried to return to the tent to recover their clothing since the danger had passed. But it was too cold, and they all froze to death before they could locate their tent in the darkness. At some point, some of the clothes may have been recovered or swapped from the dead, but at any rate, the group of 4 whose bodies was most severely damaged were caught in an avalanche and buried under 4 meters, 13 feet, of snow. Dubinina's tongue was likely removed by scavengers and ordinary predation. In 2019, a team of Swedish and Russian investigators examined the site of the incident and proposed that a violent katabatic wind could have been the cause for the incident. Katabatic winds are somewhat rare events and can be extremely violent. In 1978 at Annaris Mountain in Sweden, katabatic winds caused death of 8 hikers and 1 was severely injured. The topography of these locations was noted to be very similar according to the expedition. A sudden katabatic wind would have made it impossible to remain in the tent, and the most rational course of action would have been for the hikers to cover the tent with snow and seek shelter behind the tree line. On top of the tent, there was also a flashlight left turned on, possibly left there intentionally so that the hikers could find their way back to the tent once the wind subsided. The expedition proposed that the group of hikers constructed 2 shelters, one of which collapsed, leaving 4 of the hikers buried with the severe injuries observed. One theory suggests a Soviet parachute mine exercise was the cause. This theory alleges that the group, woken by loud explosions, fled the tent in a shoeless panic and found themselves unable to return for supply retrieval. After some members froze to death trying the escape bombs, the others tried to get back to camp fatally injured by subsequent parachute mine concussions. There are indeed records of parachute mines being tested by the Soviet military in the area around the time the hikers were there. Parachute mines detonate while still in the air rather than upon striking the Earth's surface and produce signature injuries similar to those experienced by the hikers, heavy internal damage with relatively little external trauma. The theory coincides with reported sightings of glowing, orange orbs floating or falling in the sky within the general vicinity of the hikers and allegedly photographed by them, potentially military aircraft or descending parachute mines. A similar theory alleges the testing of radiological weapons and is based partly on the discovery of radioactivity on some of the clothing as well as the descriptions of the bodies by relatives as having orange skin and gray hair. However, radioactive dispersal would have affected all, not just some, of the hikers and equipment, and the skin and hair discoloration can be explained by a natural process of mummification after 3 months of exposure to the cold and wind. One theory suggests that the hikers' deaths were most likely caused by hypothermia, which can induce a behavior known as paradoxical undressing, in which people suffer from severe hypothermia would feel like they are burning up and remove their clothes. It is undisputed that 6 of the 9 hikers died of hypothermia. However, others in the group appear to have acquired additional clothing, which suggests that they were of a sound enough mind to try to add layers. On April 12, 2018, Zolotaryov's remains were exhumed and one of the experts said that the character of the injuries resembled a person knocked down by a car, and the DNA analysis did not reveal any similarity to the DNA of living relatives. In February 2019, authorities reopened the investigation into the incident, although only 3 possible explanations were being considered: an avalanche, a slab avalanche, or a hurricane. Today the group's tomb is located at the Mykolovskoye Cemetery in Ekaterinburg, Russia. So that's all we got about Dyatlov Pass incident, and thanks for watching. If you liked the video, please hit the like button. If you want to see more videos, hit the subscribe button, and if you have something to say, please leave a comment.